We'll take a look at the body's other great way of communicating and determining what needs to be done within the body. We have the endocrine system. So the endocrine system, similar to that of the nervous system, is that we're going to have a way to send a signal from one part of the body to another. So both of them are working to maintain homeostasis, and by doing so, communicating a specific signal off to a target organ itself. One of the big differences is in how that happens. Essentially, the endocrine system is going to need to utilize the cardiovascular system in order to transport its signal, versus the nervous system simply sends that signal directly to the target organ itself via the axons of the nerves. And so we have a big change there, which means that the nervous system can send its information, in a sense, very quickly from one place to the next, versus the endocrine system is going to take a little bit of a time because it's going to travel throughout the entire body. The difference then comes down to what happens after that signal gets to its target, in that when we have the nervous system, it's very quick, and so it's going to get there very quickly, and then it's not going to last for very long, so it's going to end very quickly. The endocrine system is going to get there relatively slowly, and it's also going to last for quite a bit of time, and so we're going to have an extended period of time where that signal is, in a sense, still being given. So we previously looked at the endocrine glands and exocrine glands back during digestion when we looked at the pancreas. And there we saw a little bit, and we also saw it when we looked at the sweat glands. And one of the things that we saw there was that those glands have ducts, and so they have a way to get the material that they're producing out onto a body surface. And so it's going to go out onto the surface of the body somewhere, whether that surface is the skin, whether that surface is inside the digestive tract, along the lining of the digestive tract. It's going to make its way out onto the surface somewhere. Versus an endocrine gland, there are no ducts. And so their products essentially just go right out into the extracellular fluid and then end up getting picked up by the bloodstream. So they move into the blood vessels to get moved along in that way. When we look at the endocrine system, since they have to utilize the cardiovascular system in order to transport their product, they need to have a good blood supply. And so they're always going to be highly vascularized when we see endocrine glands. The hormones that are being produced by the endocrine glands are of one of a few different types. And so we have different kinds of substances that are produced, and they fall under one of three general classes. And so we either have peptides, we have steroids, and we have biogenic amines for the different kinds there. Regardless of the type, the target tissue is always going to have a specific type of a receptor to receive that particular hormone. If a cell doesn't have the right receptor, it doesn't even know that that hormone is there. And so it's just going to, in a sense, kind of float right on past for them. So if the cell is lacking the specific receptor, it's not going to be able to bind, it's not going to be able to do its job. And so if we have a cell and that receptor, in a sense, kind of looks like this, so to speak, and that's the receptor that it has, and the hormone that comes along looks like this, that hormone can't fit inside there. It needs to have a cell that has the right kind of a receptor on it that it's going to be able to receive it. And so now we can get that hormone to come inside there, and now it fits inside that particular receptor. So they're very specific as to the type of bond that they can create between that hormone and the receptor itself. So when we look at the individual types of hormones that we have, peptides being our first one here, peptides are put together via amino acids. They're going to be similar to our biogenic amines as well. And as we put those amino acids together, we end up with some sort of peptide or protein that we have. These peptides and proteins aren't able to enter into the cells, so they're going to utilize a second messenger system. And so they're going to have to bind to a receptor on the outside of the cell, and then essentially a chemical reaction occurs on the inside. Steroid hormones are able to get through that membrane, and so they're able to move through the cell's plasma membrane. They are cholesterol based. So they have as their primary makeup is cholesterol themselves. So another reason why we need cholesterol in the bodies themselves, and part of the reason why the liver makes it for us all the time. Once it binds to that particular receptor that's there, then it's going to allow for something to happen inside the cell. It may turn on different genes. It may start to produce substances, so we may transcribe mRNA that's there. Then we can start to make other hormones. We can start to make other secretions that are going to go out depending upon what that particular cell does. And then lastly, we have our biogenic amines. And so once again, these are made up of amino acids. And so we're going to take an amino acid and we're going to alter the structure of that amino acid a little bit. And this allows us to then utilize them as a hormone. This one is goes two ways to the cell itself. It either uses a receptor on the membrane, and so it's going to be on the outside of the cell, or it goes through the plasma membrane and binds the receptor inside the cytoplasm. Either way, it's then going to be able to do its job. In order to maintain proper homeostasis in the body, in order to maintain proper hormone levels in the body, we utilize feedback loops. And so we have two types of feedback. We have either negative feedback or positive feedback. The more common of the two types is negative feedback. And so negative feedback is utilized more within the body. And essentially the basics behind negative feedback is that we have, in a sense, I didn't really draw that straight enough. We have a line that we're going to try and toe. And so we're going to have this line where, in a sense, that's our homeostasis. And with negative feedback, things can end up going too high, and then they come back down low, and then they come back up high, and then they come down low. All the time we kind of have this average in the middle that we're trying to keep things at. And so negative feedback does just that. When things start to go too high, we're going to do something to bring it back down low. And so we're going to make an adjustment to bring that particular level or that particular metabolic activity back down towards the normal. And sometimes it goes too far. The classic kind of example of this is that of eating and glucose control. And so after a meal, our pancreas is going to release insulin. And so we're going to release insulin into the blood. And this is going to allow us to lower our blood sugar levels. After we've gone a while without a meal, our blood glucose levels start to fall, and in response, we're going to start to release glucagon. And so glucagon is going to help to then raise up our blood glucose levels. And so just like the first drawing that I had there, essentially we're going up and then down, and then up and then down, and then up and then down. And the process keeps on going around and around. And as long as we keep it within the margin of error that we have for that particular level, for that particular substance, all is going to, in a sense, be good. And so we're going to be able to maintain it throughout that process there. For positive feedback, with positive feedback, when we have kind of something going on in the body, and this doesn't really work quite as well, but in a sense, as something is going up, with positive feedback, we're going to make it go up even further. We're going to make this process go faster and faster and faster and faster as far as the loop itself goes. And so with positive feedback is going to always exacerbate the original stimulus. And so whatever is going on, we're going to turn it up even more than it was before. And so a couple of different examples that we have that use positive feedback in the body, one of which is breastfeeding. And so the production and the letdown of milk from the mammary glands is controlled by a process that uses a positive feedback loop. And so suckling from the baby stimulates the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then releases oxytocin. Oxytocin comes down to the mammary glands, and then down at the mammary glands, it's going to stimulate milk ejection. And so the milk is then going to be ejected from the mammary glands themselves. And then, in a sense, as baby gets more milk, they continue to feed. This process keeps going around and around until something stops it, until something, in a sense, big happens. And what's big going to happen here is essentially baby's full, so baby stops suckling. This also occurs with things like childbirth and blood clotting as well. And so with like blood clotting, we have the original damage to the blood vessel. We start to send out chemical signals that say that we're bleeding, we need to form a blood clot. And as more of those platelets start to come into the area, they send off more signals and more signals and more signals until something big happens, some sort of big climactic event, which is either we have a blood clot, and so we don't need to make more of a blood clot, or we have no more blood and the person has, in a sense, bled out. And so something big has to stop positive feedback loops. This control of our hormones within the body ultimately comes down to the control of the hypothalamus. And so the hypothalamus is, that we've seen back in the nervous system, is the master control of the body. And so this is going to be our master control for all metabolic activity within the body itself. And as such, it controls releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. And so it has the ability to either tell another endocrine organ to release its hormones or to inhibit it from releasing those hormones. At the same time, it also sends down nervous impulses down to places like the posterior pituitary and the adrenal glands. And so it has direct nervous input to them as well. So the hypothalamus is an important aspect for our hormone control, but it also produces two hormones. And so it produces oxytocin, and then it produces antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. And so it produces both of those hormones, but those hormones are actually going to be sent from the hypothalamus down to the posterior pituitary to be stored. And so it doesn't actually release them from the hypothalamus directly. It sends them down to the posterior pituitary. That's there. With that, it then has the ability to send down nervous fibers when it needs to be able to tell it to control there. Some of our hormones don't have to have direct control by the hypothalamus. They're going to use things like the levels of our calcium, the levels of our sodium, things like that, that are going to help to control their output as well. But overall, the hypothalamus is the one that's going to control basically everything in the body. Next up, we have the pituitary gland. And so the pituitary gland is a little tiny, almost smaller than a pea almost structure that sits inside the cella turcica here, inside the bone, and kind of hangs off of the hypothalamus itself. And so as it sits there, it has two different portions to it. We have an anterior pituitary, and then we have a posterior pituitary. They are connected back up to the hypothalamus via the infundibulum. And so they're connected there via that infundibulum there, and we have the ability to have that connection. And so we're going to have both nervous connection, and we're also going to have a large amount of blood supply. And so we have this hypophyseal portal system. And so this portal system is what's going to allow us to, in a sense, move hormones in the sense of releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary. It's going to allow us to carry away those hormones from the anterior pituitary, as well as carry oxytocin and ADH away from the posterior pituitary. So lots of blood supply coming into there for the two of them to function. For our anterior pituitary, the anterior pituitary produces a large number of hormones. And so with that, we're going to have to know essentially the hormone and where it goes to. And so what's that hormone? Where does it go to in the body? And what's it going to cause to happen in that target tissue itself on there. In the set of notes, you can find a list or a chart that has the hormones, and then it also has the function of those hormones as well. And so you'll need to know and be able to utilize that for the test. For growth hormone, so growth hormone goes out, and growth hormone is going to essentially target all of our cells. It's going to have a large function on things like bone and muscle as we grow, but essentially all of the cells in the body utilize growth hormone. Growth hormone, though, is actually going to get converted into a substance called insulin-like growth factor, which is then going to be the end product, in a sense, of growth hormone. Next up, we have thyroid stimulating hormone. And so, as the name implies, it's going to stimulate the thyroid gland. And so TSH, our thyroid stimulating hormone, ends up going down to the thyroid gland and stimulates it to produce its hormones. We then have adrenocorticotropic hormone, say that 3 times, ACTH, so kind of a mouthful there. ACTH is going to stimulate our adrenal glands, and so it's going to go down to the adrenal cortex, and it's going to stimulate the secretions of our cortex there. Next, we have 3 that are related to the reproductive system. We have luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and prolactin. And so luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, LH and FSH, these two kind of go hand in hand. They're going to go down to the reproductive organs, and so whether male or female, they're going to go down there, and luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate the gonads, and as it does so, it's going to stimulate the production of hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone is then going to go down to those same gonads, either the ovaries or the testes, and it's going to stimulate the production of the gametes. And so in terms of the ovary, it's going to be the eggs, and then for the testes, it's going to stimulate the production of sperm cells. Prolactin is one that is essentially only found in lactating females. And so with prolactin, this is going to increase milk production. So we talked a little bit about oxytocin in our positive feedback loop. Both oxytocin and prolactin are required for milk production and then milk letdown. So our posterior pituitary, we're going to now be able to see our oxytocin. So it was manufactured by the hypothalamus, but stored down here in the posterior pituitary, as well as ADH, our antidiuretic hormone. So ADH is going to cause the kidneys to start to reabsorb more sodium. And so it's going to increase sodium absorption. And as it does so, that's going to increase the amount of water that's coming back into the body. So we're not losing it. That then increases blood volume, which then increases blood pressure. Oxytocin is going to be utilized in both males and females again. In non-pregnant, non-lactating females and males, this both has a role in the sexual response for them and causes smooth muscle contractions, and so that of the male reproductive ducts, and then in the female for the uterus. In the pregnant and or lactating female, this is going to be utilized for during labor, so during child delivery. It causes uterine contractions. And then for the mammary glands after birth, it then causes milk ejection. The thyroid gland, this is one now where we're leaving the head in terms of leaving the brain area and moving down into the neck. This is one of the things that the endocrine system has the ability to do, is that since it uses the cardiovascular system, it doesn't have to be centralized. So we're going to find that the endocrine system is kind of all over the body itself. So for the thyroid glands, they lie inside the neck. It has kind of a butterfly shape to them. And so it has a lobe on either side, and then it's connected together by an isthmus. And so we have a right lobe and a left lobe, and then connected together by this isthmus in the middle. And that connects the two of them together there. Its job is to produce thyroid hormone. And so thyroid hormone, once again, is going to go out and essentially stimulate all areas of the body. And so here we can see it sitting inside the neck there, just below the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage of the larynx. And we have the two lobes connected by that isthmus right in the neck there. In the cadaver picture here, you can see how it really kind of blends in with the rest of the tissue, a little bit difficult to find, so to speak. So the production of the thyroid gland is thyroxine, or T4, and so that's going to be one of its major producers. It also produces T3 as well in a different hormone state. Both of those go out and increase body metabolism, and so they're going to allow for the body to increase its overall metabolism, so essentially most cells get stimulated by the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland also, though, participates in calcium control, and so calcitonin is going to be released when we've had a meal that has a large amount of calcium. So its job is to decrease calcium levels in body fluids, and so essentially take it out of the blood. So in order to do that, it inhibits osteoclasts. Remember that osteoclasts break down bone. So if we've got excess amounts of calcium already, we don't want any more bone to get broken down. And so we're going to stop that process there. It also allows for the kidneys to lose calcium, to get rid of the calcium and not try and reabsorb all that it can. For our thyroid, this is one of the more complex stimulating processes that we have for hormones themselves. And so it involves the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the thyroid gland. So the hypothalamus produces TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. That then stimulates the anterior pituitary to release TSH. And then the TSH comes down and to the thyroid gland and causes the release of thyroid hormone. And depending upon the amount of thyroid hormone that is out there, that then feeds back to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus then either increases or decreases TRH. The parathyroid glands are what's going to pair up with the calcitonin from the thyroid gland in order to allow us to control calcium levels once again. The parathyroid gland is typically two paired little nodules that sit on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. Inside it, there are two cell types. So here we have them sitting on the back of the thyroid, and they're paired on either side. They, again, almost kind of blend in with the thyroid gland itself. And so parathyroid hormone produced by the parathyroid gland and the chief cells, the oxyphil cells, we don't really know what they do or what their function is in the parathyroid gland, but they are there. So with calcium levels, as calcium levels rise, we're going to get calcitonin. As calcium levels fall, we're going to get parathyroid hormone. And so as we maintain that level up once again of calcium, so that we're never too high or too low. Because remember back to different systems that we've talked about already, and we have the need for calcium. Bones, muscles, nervous system, blood clotting, all require calcium. And so those are kind of the biggies as far as the places in the body where we need to be able to maintain those levels at all times. So different process here. We've got two different organs involved. We've got the parathyroid gland, and then we've got the thyroid gland for our calcitonin. And that's going to maintain all of that calcium levels by, in the bone, affecting osteoclasts. So we're either going to turn on osteoclastic activity, parathyroid, or we're going to turn it off, calcitonin. Same thing with the kidneys. We're either going to turn on reabsorption or turn off reabsorption. And then from there, we're going to tell the digestive tract to absorb as much calcium as we can, things like that. And so big process to maintain those calcium levels at all costs. Moving out of the head and neck now, we move down to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands themselves sit down on the kidneys, and so they're kind of a pyramid-shaped structure. And so when we see the adrenal glands, they kind of have a pyramid shape to them. They then kind of look like a hat almost as they sit on top of the kidney there. The adrenal glands have a cortex, and then they have a medulla, the cortex being on the outside, the medulla being on the inside for those. And they produce different types of hormones that are there. And so for the most part, we think of the adrenal glands as being kind of our stress glands. And so these are the ones that are going to become active when our body is under some sort of stress. Either physical stress, we're sick, we're injured, things like that, we're fighting. So it's going to work also with the sympathetic nervous system to allow for the survival needs that we have during those times of stress. And so as we see here with the adrenal glands and the medulla gives us epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those two are going to work in conjunction with the autonomic system in the sympathetic side and allow for increases in heart rate, contractility of the heart, blood pressure to go up, glycogen breakdown to occur so that we get glucose out into the body to power us during those times of stress. Working with that, we also then have the cortex. And so the cortex is going to produce its own hormones as well. We're going to deal with minerals. And so we're going to deal with things like sodium. We're going to deal with glucose once again. And so we're going to have our glucocorticoids as well. And then we're going to deal with reproduction. And so we're going to have our gonatocorticoids as well. And so different types of hormones. Aldosterone, kind of the most prevalent or the most important one that we see in the adrenal glands for the mineralocorticoids. Aldosterone is then going to allow us to reabsorb sodium so that we increase the amount of sodium reabsorption that is there. Glucocorticoids are going to be our cortisol for our most important one. This is going to liberate energy. This is once again going to break down glycogen. This is going to break down lipids, break down proteins in order to get us everything that we need to be able to make energy. And there we can see them kind of sitting on top of the kidneys. So 3 different regions. We have the zona glomerulosa producing our mineralocorticoids. We have our zona fasciculata producing our glucocorticoids, and then our zona reticularis producing our gonatocorticoids, and then the adrenal medulla producing our epinephrine and norepinephrine. The pancreas we talked about a little bit back when we did the digestive system. So we saw that then that the pancreas was both an exocrine as well as an endocrine organ. So the majority of all of that pancreas is exocrine in nature. It's producing digestive enzymes that are going to come along the pancreatic duct and make its way out into the duodenum and supply all of the digestive enzymes that it needs for normal food digestion. But small little portions of the pancreas are going to be dedicated to endocrine. And so these are going to be our islets of Langerhans, or pancreatic islets that are there. In those pancreatic islets, we find a couple of different types of cell. Some of the more important ones are glucagon and insulin. So we just talked about those when we talked about our negative feedback loop. And so glucagon and insulin work once again, going back and forth to maintain our normal glucose levels. And so as glucose levels fall, we're going to release glucagon. As glucose levels rise, we're going to release insulin. So insulin reduces the amount of blood glucose, and glucagon increases the amount of blood glucose that's there. In addition to those two, we also have somatostatin produced by delta cells. And these delta cells are going to essentially work on the pancreas itself. And so it's going to inhibit the production and secretion of glucagon. And so it's going to decrease the function of our glucagon. And this allows us to kind of slow the rate of food absorption. So this is going to allow us to feed back into the alpha and beta cells. Alpha cells are for glucagon, beta cells for insulin. And when they do so, they then allow for essentially our food to kind of take a little bit longer time to get into the bloodstream. Our last set of cells are the F cells, and these F cells produce pancreatic polypeptide, and these ones are then going to go over and inhibit somatostatin. So again, we have this process where we are feeding back always in on the others. And so here we can see our classic acinar cells or exocrine cells. And then we have a nice pancreatic islet or islet of Langerhans. And inside there, we then have our predominant alpha and beta cells with some delta and F cells thrown in the mix as well. Next up, we go back to the brain, and we have the pineal gland or the pineal body. This is a small little structure that sits at the posterior side of the diencephalon. So it's kind of at the very back of the epithalamus. Its one claim to fame in terms of hormones is melatonin. And so melatonin is an important hormone when it comes to our circadian rhythms. Melatonin levels, again, are going to rise and fall throughout the day. And as they rise and fall, these are going to go with light levels around us, so kind of ambient light levels themselves. And so it's going to rise when it starts to get dark, and then it's going to fall as it starts to get light with those. And so this is going to allow us to control kind of that biological clock that we have running every single day. And so this is why if we go and jump multiple time zones, our body's normal clock says it's bedtime, but the clock on the wall says that it's still time to be up. And so this is where we kind of have to readjust over a period of several days in order to get that to occur. Next up, we have the thymus. The thymus is, we talked back when we did the immune system as well as the lymphatic system. And so the thymus is the one endocrine organ that essentially feeds in on itself. And so it's going to be there, and it's going to essentially stimulate itself only. And so it doesn't have to go very far for its hormones. As well, this is the one important organ that decreases in size as we age. And so it sits inside the mediastinum. It's there, it's big, it grows throughout our whole childhood, and then by the time we hit adulthood, it starts to shrink, and then it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks as we get older and older. It produces hormones, thymosins and thymopoietin, and these hormones are going to stimulate the maturation of T cells. And so this is going to help with the T cell maturation, so it doesn't really need to go anywhere other than to the thymus itself. In addition to the big endocrine organs, many of our other organs actually have an endocrine function as well. Everything from the kidneys to the heart to the digestive tract to reproductive organs, they all have some endocrine function within them. And so they're going to be able to alter things elsewhere in the body as well as within them. A lot of times these ones are kind of self-preservation types of hormones. This being in the case, we have the kidneys. And so the kidneys produce a couple of different hormones, one of which being renin. And so renin is going to allow for the secretion of aldosterone. So it's going to go up to the adrenal glands and call for the release of aldosterone. And more importantly, it's going to convert angiotensin into angiotensin 2. And so we're going to get this angiotensin that's there, and this is going to help to raise blood pressure. The kidneys like to have high blood pressure, so they're going to be kind of self-preserving here with the production of renin. As O2 levels change throughout the kidneys as well, they're going to produce another hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO. This, you'll remember, is there for the production of more red blood cells. And so it's going to stimulate the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells if O2 levels drop for any significant period of time. Calcitriol, so this one here is going to be released as well. And so when parathyroid hormone is released, this is going to then go down and stimulate the kidneys to release calcitriol. Calcitriol is then going to stimulate the intestines to absorb as much calcium as well as phosphate as possible. So that's going to allow us to store our calcium phosphate inside the bones themselves. The heart produces atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. This is going to be released in response to blood pressure that has risen. And so as blood pressure goes up, ANP is going to be released in order to reduce blood pressure. It does so by going down to the kidneys and stimulating the kidneys to get rid of sodium. And where sodium goes, water is going to follow. And so the water is going to be released with it as well. And then that's going to allow us to decrease our blood volume and consequently reduce the blood pressure at the same time. Our reproductive organs, as we've seen before, produce hormones. And so for the female, they produce estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. And so 3 different hormones. The estrogen itself in females is going to go out and essentially it affects just about all cells in the body, but especially those of the reproductive organs. And so it has a role in things like the uterine lining, the production of oocytes in the first place. When levels start to rise during puberty, we get secondary sexual characteristics starting to come out, things like that. Progesterone gets the uterus ready for implantation. And so it's preparing the uterus for implantation. So those levels are going to be elevated during the latter part of the reproductive cycle in order to make sure that the uterus is ready. And then we have inhibin. And so this one is going to decrease the amount of follicle stimulating hormone. And so when pregnancy occurs, we want inhibin there to stop another follicle from maturing. For the male, the hormones produced are testosterone and inhibin as well. And so testosterone and inhibin we have there. Again, testosterone, much like estrogen, essentially affects all of the cells of the body. And so again, this is going to do things like our secondary sexual characteristics during puberty. This is going to allow for the production of our gametes or the sperm cells that are there. And then from there, we have inhibin. And so inhibin itself is going to feed back on the brain and reduce the amount of FSH that's there. So if sperm levels are elevated, we don't need to be producing more sperm cells if they're not being used in a sense. And so inhibin is going to decrease FSH, and that's going to maintain normal hormone levels. And so the endocrine system is our big system for control throughout the entire body. And so this is maintaining our homeostasis and making sure that everything is running the way that it should.